Lately, I was thinking a lot about small changes to game mechanics and how they influence the overall experience, the so-called game feel. I thought that those two games would make a pretty good case study for this particular subject. Hear me out, God of War 2018 and Sekiro are fundamentally very similar. They are both third-person action games with melee combat. Both of them have pretty similar fighting systems. You have your fast attack, light attack, stronger but slower attack that you can charge. You can block some of the enemy's attacks. You have lots of powerful special attacks that bring variety and let you express yourself in more ways. And also, the fact that enemies have basically two health bars. One is the regular health bar, which you deplete with your attacks, and when it goes down the enemy dies, and second one representing enemy's posture, or if you prefer its stamina. Finishing this one opens the opponent for a powerful, brutal finisher. I am aware that those were very shallow descriptions of those mechanics, and I am more than aware that you can describe like that much more third-person fighting games. I'm not saying that God of War and Sekiro are any special in this comparison. You could change Sekiro for Dark Souls, for example, The Surge or Devil May Cry. I chose those two games because I love them a lot. They both are very close to my gamer's heart. This decision had definitely nothing to do with the current hype surrounding God of War Ragnarok and the fact that I have 150 GB of Sekiro footage sitting on my disk. Over the course of this video, I will try to compare a few game mechanics, explain how developers made them feel different in both games, and maybe, just maybe, show you some of my sick gamer skills. At its core, posture works like a stamina bar. In the Dark Souls, blocking an incoming attack drains your stamina. How much stamina is being drained depends on the shield stability. If you're a shield lover, then you're not playing those games in a fun way. You're playing them in a wrong way. But if you're a shield lover, then you probably know what happens when your stamina drops down to zero. Your guard is broken and you're left vulnerable for a short time. Some enemies can even take advantage of that fact and serve you a pretty painful stab in your back or abdomen. In God of War 2018, all enemies have a visible stamina bar that fills up every time they take damage. Usually, if you attack them with your axe, the health bar is draining way faster than the stamina bar is being filled. This is why you can unequip your weapon and fight the opponent with your bare fists. They deal less damage, but are great for staggering enemies. Player is given choice here, and the more choices the player has, the better they can express themselves through combat. The better they can express themselves, the more connected they feel. It makes the whole experience more personal. Anyways, when you fill up the stagger meter, you're rewarded with the opportunity to perform a powerful and quite satisfying finisher. Most of them mean certain death to your opponent. The rest resolves in some pretty spectacular actions like running with a dragger or riding an ogre. And what about Sekiro? Enemies in this game also have stamina bars, though this game calls it posture rather than stamina. And it works almost identical as in the God of War. When you attack an enemy, besides dealing regular damage, you also drain their posture. When it drops down to 0, they fall on the ground and you can perform pretty gruesome finisher. I will not describe it in such details as I did with God of War, simply because I would have to repeat myself. Those systems are really similar, that is, at least at their core. So let's cut to the chase and jump straight into the differences between those two implementations of an enemy's stamina bar thing, system, posture, meter. I would say that in Sekiro this mechanic is a bit more developed. By that I mean that in this game killing enemies by draining their posture is way more important than in the God of War. It is almost necessary in some cases, like with this warrior for example. It is very hard to kill him by draining his health bar. And now I know, in God of War there were Hellwalkers, enemies that can't be hurt with your icy axe. But in this game there are also many opponents that simply don't have a stamina bar. Baldur, all the Valkyries, Magni and Modi, well, bosses in general, while Sekiro is dedicated to this idea that every entity in Ashina has a posture meter, just like the player's character. I would guess that they made it like this because they wanted to show that those rules, that having a stamina applies to everyone, even to the main character. By doing that, they can sell you a lie that nobody is special, that the protagonist, the player himself, is bounded by the same rules as the enemies he's slain are. Kratos, on the other hand, doesn't have a stamina bar. He can block incoming attacks as long as he wants without lowering his shield, that is of course if the attack is blockable. Blockable. Another difference is the fact that in Sekiro you can damage enemies' posture without damaging their health. You could do it either by attacking their guard or by parrying their attacks. We'll get back to the parry mechanic later in the video. In theory, you could complete the whole game without ever draining enemy's health bar, but in practice, well, in many cases posture recovers too fast for that to be a reliable strategy. As I already said, stamina system in Sekiro is a bit more developed. The rate at which posture recovers depends on the entity's health. When the health is greater than 75%, posture recovers with maximum rate, but when HP drops below that, the recovery rate drops as well. Between 50 and 75% posture recovers with 66% of maximum rate. From 25 to 50 it's only 33%, and when HP drops below 25%, posture doesn't recover at all. This applies both to the enemies you face and to your character. Again, the rules of this universe apply to everyone, which makes the overall experience more believable. By putting more emphasis on the posture, Sekiro makes it more about clashing swords in an elegant dance between two warriors. It's not about who loses more blood, it's about who will endure longer, who will first miss a parry. It's about patience. God of War doesn't give a fuck about what is elegance or not. God of War is brutal. God of War is all about losing blood. It's about crushing your opponent's skulls to the ground. It's about pure strength. And I would say that destroying your enemies with bare fists shows that primal strength rather well. Parrying is another mechanic present in both games. It is one of three main defensive actions you can make. The others are dodge and block, which are, by the way, also present in both games. But let's focus on parry, cause it is one of the most spectacular or complex actions among them. You're not stupid, so even if you haven't played those games, you'll still probably have a pretty good understanding on how parrying works. Right before enemy's weapon is about to hit you, you press a button and bada bim bada boom, you not only do not take any damage, but you can also follow up with a quick counterattack. Parry is so-called high risk, high reward mechanic. In the God of War, you can't just parry every attack. There are 3 tiers of attacks. First tier, the weakest, has no indicator to it. You can just parry it, and if you miss a timing, no worries, you can just block it. Second tier attacks are indicated by a yellow ring around the opponent's weapon. You can still parry those attacks, but trying to block them will break your guard, leaving you vulnerable for a short time. And third tier, indicated by a similar ring, this time red one. You can't block it, you can't even parry it. Either action will result in you taking damage. If you haven't played God of War but you are familiar with Sekiro, this probably sounds oddly familiar. In Sekiro, you also have 3 kinds of attacks. The normal one with no indicator, a thrust attack that you can't block but you can parry it with perfect timing, and unparable sweep, kurwa. A thrust attack that you can't block but you can parry it with perfect timing, and unparable sweep. Thrust and sweep are indicated by both enemies' body language and Japanese symbols that appear moments before attack is about to land. When I first realized how similar those games are, I was stunned. Sure, there is way more to the parry mechanic than just categorizing what attacks you can or can't parry. For example, the timing window, the speed of a parry, of enemies' attacks, the animations, audio design, but there are so many parallels. No, not even parallels. There are so many things that are exactly the same in Sekiro and God of War that I had to make a video about it. It's so interesting to me that by just adding a few minor changes, minor, it depends how you look at it, but From Software and Santa Monica Studio have managed to create so different parrying experiences. So, what differentiates Sekiro's parry from the God of War one? Probably the biggest difference is the fact that in Sekiro, parrying drains enemies' posture. This adds yet another layer to the stamina system in this game. When Kratos parries incoming attack, it doesn't affect enemies' stamina in any way, but in God of War, you have a lot more counterattack options. After a successful parry, Kratos can either perform a light or a heavy counterattack. Those counterattacks are great for quickly draining enemies' posture or for kicking them away from you, which helps a lot in controlling the crowd of enemies. You don't really have a proper counterattack in Sekiro, but you do deal extra posture damage for a brief moment after a successful parry if you have the right skill unlocked. Parrying in both games is extremely satisfying. All the feedback that you get, sounds, controller vibrations, enemy stagger, visual effects, all those things encourage the player to take the risk and try to parry incoming attacks rather than to block or dodge them. Though you definitely perform more parries in Sekiro, I would say that this mechanic does not differ that much between those games. Kratos' parry feels more heavier, meatier than Sekiro's one, but besides that, they are really similar. You know what? I might as well dedicate a whole segment to the overall third-person combat experience. This topic is so vast that I won't even try to cover it in more details than necessary for this weird comparison video. But if you'd like to watch something that focuses more on analyzing the differences in third-person combat games, I've actually made a video comparing Norse God of War to its Greek predecessor. However, I warn you, that was my first video on YouTube. First video that I've ever made, so the quality might not be as good as on this one. Having this obligatory self-promotion part out of the way, let's start with the most important thing for any third-person action game. Let's start with the camera. In God of War, the camera hangs low behind Kratos' back. It's close, really close, almost like we're standing right behind him, peeking over his shoulder. It's great for immersion. This perspective brings the player closer to the action, but at the same time, it's pretty bad for our perception of what is happening on the battlefield. Because of this choice, turning Kratos 180 degrees takes some time and feels kinda clunky. You even have a dedicated button for this action, but at least for me, using it feels unnatural, unintuitive. Even though you have way narrower view on the battlefield, The enemies are designed in such a way that they will try their best to get into your view cone before they decide to attack you. You also have those arrows at Kratos' feet that appear when someone decides to attack you from behind, maybe try a fireball or something. Thanks to this camera design, the overall combat in God of War feels very heavy, very grounded. Because you are so close to the action, you can experience Kratos' brutality in all its glory. When we switch back to the Sekiro, we immediately can tell the difference in the camera design philosophy. It's further, and it's higher than in God of War. Wolf takes less screen space when compared to Kratos, you have better view on your surroundings, and the overall camera feels more responsive. This of course has its own pros and cons. The fights feel less personal, it makes it harder for the players to immerse themselves in this world, in the combat. Thanks God that the camera zooms in for those brutal finishers. This camera placement also allows the Sekiro protagonist to be more agile, swifter. I would argue that it also helps us to connect with the main character better, or rather, get into his shoes. Hear me out here. In God of War, you cannot rotate Kratos without rotating camera. Camera controls Kratos. It feels, at least for me, as if I am the camera. I am some random cameraman that follows Kratos and Atreus on their journey. In Sekiro, on the other hand, character controls are independent from the camera. Maybe apart from aiming at tree branches and hooks that you can grapple to. Maybe it's just my own experience, but I felt more connected to Kratos' character, to his personality, than to the wolves. However, when I played Sekiro, I've realized that it felt more like my journey, rather than wolves. Sure, with Kratos you go on an amazing adventure, very emotional journey, but as I said, it's his journey. You are going with Kratos, not the other way around. Hey, maybe that's just me. There is a chance that all that I've just said doesn't make any sense at all, so it would be super cool if you could just let me know in the comments. What do you think about that? What is the second most important thing in a third-person action game? Yeah, it's weapons. There's not much to say about Sekiro's katana. Kusubimaru, cause that's how it's called, has pretty basic moveset. Press attack button for its fast vertical slash, hold it to perform slower but more powerful thrust. You can use it to block or parry enemy attacks. You can expand upon this basic moveset by unlocking new skills. With those skills you unlock combat arts and new jutsu techniques. They are special moves that come in handy in various situations. There is some great lore behind this weapon, but most of it are just theories. If you are into lore hunting, I suggest you check out my Sekiro iceberg video that I've made a few months ago. I would say that the Leviathan axe in God of War has more complex starting moveset, that is, the default moveset, without spending any skill points. You have your regular fast attack, but unlike in Sekiro, you also have a stronger, slower attack. Yes, in Sekiro you had slower, more powerful attack, but it was a charged attack. In God of War you also have the ability to throw your axe at distant enemies, and here you also have an option to choose between faster or slower throw. You can even freeze your opponent if you aim just right, or aim at their feet and watch as they fall down. Of course, later you unlock more moves, and I don't mean special attacks like in Sekiro. I mean moves like light run-up attack, heavy run-up attack, dodge away attack, charge throw that targets multiple enemies, attack that you perform while light your stance attack, return heavy stance attack, charged heavy attack, light attack, to name just a few. So yeah, you have a pretty large moveset in God of War, especially compared to Sekiro. Of course, I'm talking here about quote basic attacks. I'm not taking into consideration any runic attacks, prosthetic tools and combos that you can perform with those tools. You may not agree here, but I would say that God of War puts way bigger emphasis on things you can do to the enemies, and Sekiro cares more about things that enemies can do to you. I am aware that proving this statement would require me to carefully analyze enemies, bosses, every combat art and runic attack. Maybe it's not that obvious that enemies in Sekiro have more complex attack patterns, longer combos, more flashy moves, but there is certainly something to the idea that in God of War you have lots of options in which you can interact with the enemies. Okay, I have to do it. At this point, you've probably begun to have thoughts like this. Why the hell is he comparing God of War to Sekiro? They are two different games. Or, this dude is saying so obvious things. Of course, cameras in those games are different. First, I thank you for giving my video a shot. It really means a lot to me that you spend your free time watching something that I've made. Second, I'm aware that some stuff I've said may be obvious to you, dear viewer, but I still hope that at least some of you find this stuff as interesting as I do. God of War and Sekiro are two entirely different games, and comparing them to each other, but are they really? As I said at the beginning, they are both third-person action games with strong emphasis on exploration. Both have really similar mechanics that were already listed in this video. I believe that understanding what makes those games similar and what differentiates them is essential to understanding game design philosophy of such games. And if you don't share my point of view, well... Anyways, shall we continue? I just wanna add that in God of War you basically have two other weapons besides the Leviathan axe, each with its own moveset. So like, it should be pretty obvious that God of War is more about how you can interact with enemies rather than how the enemies interact with you. And let me just tell you how amazing and satisfying it feels to throw an axe into Drago's head, freezing him, then run up to him and bash him onto the wall with your Spartan kick. Or throw your axe at enemies' feet and see as they crumble over and over. You can't really play like that with enemies in Sekiro. Now, let's take a closer look at your defensive options, and for a change, I'll start with Sekiro this time. You have 3 basic actions when it comes to avoiding taking damage, and if you've watched any Dark Souls or Bloodborne videos, especially those made by the holy trinity of game critics, you are more than familiar with those 3 actions. So out of respect for your time, I will only briefly describe them. They are: block. This action comes with lowest risk and lowest reward. While blocking an attack, you lose your posture, so you can't block forever. Also, not every attack can be blocked. You don't really get any reward besides not taking damage for blocking. Dodge. Dodging in Sekiro is really tricky. In previous Souls games it was your go-to if you wanted to avoid taking a hit and didn't want to use those stupid shields that only engender passivity. In Sekiro, while dodging, you have very few iframes, invincibility frames, during which you are invulnerable to any attacks. This change was probably made to encourage the player to block, or better, parry incoming attacks, rather than to dodge them like you used to in previous FromSoft games. For me, it sounds a lot like what they have done with Bloodborne. In that game, they also removed, or rather reduced the effectiveness of one of the core defensive actions in order to encourage the player to try more aggressive, more active playstyle. I'm talking of course about removing the shields from that game, but you don't really want me to start rambling about Bloodborne. This video is already way longer than I've planned it to be, and if I would start talking about Bloodborne... And last, third defensive action, parry. The high risk, high reward parry was something you wouldn't see often in Dark Souls games. This changed in Sekiro. Practically every attack is now parryable, and I would say, though this is not backed by any research, that timing a successful parry in this game is a lot easier than it used to be. To counteract this, FromSoft has changed the way how parrying works. It used to be that after a successful parry, an enemy is open to a powerful critical attack that would usually be enough to finish him off. Now, each successful parry damages the enemy's posture. If the posture drops down to 0, you can perform brutal finisher that kills your opponent instantly. That's why some enemies have 1 or even 2 revives, just like you. Again, same rules for everyone. Now, how does it look in God of War 2018? Well, as you have probably already guessed, it's pretty much the same. You block the way you expected, just this time you're not limited by your stamina in any way. In this regard, Sekiro punishes the player for just spamming poorly timed blocks. God of War is much more forgiving, although you have to keep an eye for those stronger enemies, whose attacks are indicated with an orange or red circle. Well, I've already talked about that, so depending on your input, Kratos can perform two kinds of a dodge. You either quickly press the dodge button for a fast dash, almost like in Bloodborne, I love Bloodborne, or double tap / hold the dodge button for slower roll. It's pretty obvious that the slower roll comes with more iframes than quick dash. Actually, I think it's pretty cool that the game designers gave us this option to choose between which dodge do we wanna use. It lets the players better express themselves through combat. Last but not least, parry. I haven't done any math, but if you ask me, I would say that it's pretty much as difficult as parrying in Sekiro. And just like in Sekiro, there are certain attacks that cannot be parried. Again, I already talked about that in the parry sections, so let's move on. Now, we should ask ourselves a simple question: what those subtle differences tell us about the game design philosophy of God of War and Sekiro? For starters, the fact that Kratos can perform two different dodges helps to put an emphasis in player subconsciousness on using roll or dash as main defensive move. The relatively low amount of invincibility frames in Sekiro is supposed to flesh out the parrying mechanic. The enemies' combos in that game are so long and complex that you must really pay attention when timing a parry. Like I've already said, in my eyes, God of War might not have as complex enemy design as Sekiro. The enemies you encounter on your Norse journey might not have as long combos as Japanese generals and feral monkeys you fight in Ashina, but what God of War is brilliant at is letting the player express themselves through combat on so many levels. Well, that's besides the y-axis, y-plane, cause, you know, you can jump in this game. All those ways you can interact with the enemies, freezing them, kicking them around, all those attacks with amazing animations. Animations in this game are so amazing that they deserve a separate video. And just so we're clear, I haven't said at any point that God of War has bad or poorly designed enemies. Sekiro, on the other hand, might not have so many non-special attacks. There will be a separate segment just for special moves like combat arts or runic attacks. As God of War, it might not have 3 different weapons, each with its own moveset. In Sekiro, you don't play as an immortal, inhumanly strong, super Greek god. In Sekiro, you play as a broken shinobi, a shinobi that almost lost his will to live. You don't win your fights by sheer power, you win them by being fast. You win them by being agile. By being relentless. You win them by being persistent. I know that it might be pretty obvious to you, and some of you might not agree with me. That's okay, it's just an opinion of some random dude on the internet that instead of learning for his university exams procrastinates by writing, recording and editing some stupid videos or whatever it should be called about the games he loves. By power attacks, I mean attacks such as any prosthetic tool and or prosthetic tool combo, combat arts and ninjutsu techniques in Sekiro, and also any runic attack from God of War 2018. There are a lot of them, and I obviously won't be going through all of them in this video, cause that's not my goal here. There are plenty other videos on the subject, from tier lists of the best prosthetic tool and runic attacks to the full tutorials on how to use them in most effective way. Power attacks are about two things. Well, they are mainly about two things. They are about looking cool as fuck and about giving the player more options during combat. I won't talk much about the looking cool part because it falls under the category of aesthetics, and I'm not analyzing audio or visuals here. I have already said like a dozen times that giving more options to the player is essential for a good action game. I would even argue that it is essential for any game. It would be a pretty good topic for a video, maybe someday, but I digress. In an action game, the more options, the more attacks and combos player has, well, basically the more defensive and offensive options they have, the better they can express themselves through the combat system. And of course, introducing new moves helps to break up the monotony that eventually appears if nothing changes, either on the player's end, that would be getting new moves, or on the opponent's end, that would be, for example, introducing new enemies or mechanics. So how did From Software and Santa Monica Studio implemented power attacks in their games? Let's start with the God of War. God of War combat is all about the spectacle. It always has been, since the very first installment in the series. The memorable opening level in which you fight your way through the sinking ship and, in the end, fight off a giant hydra. It was all about a spectacle. Although Norse God of War is a bit mellowed down, it's a bit slower, more grounded, the audiovisual feast is still the priority in the player's experience. And I'm not talking here only about combat, just look at those amazing settings. But of course, the main focus of this chapter is the combat system, and more precisely, runic attacks. Runic attacks are those powerful, special, almost magic-like attacks that you perform by holding your shield and then pressing either light or heavy attack button. This performs either light or heavy runic attack. They operate on a cooldown, so you don't spend any resources while performing them. This encourages using them and trying them out in different situations, unlike in Sekiro, but we'll get to that later. Even if you misjudge the situation and you waste the runic attack, you can always try again later after a short 1 or 2 minutes cooldown. New runic attacks are scattered around the map, so this system also encourages the exploration, which is great because exploration in this game is really rewarding and satisfying. In Sekiro, however, you have your prosthetic tools, items that you can also find through exploration. They are certainly less flashy than runic attacks. Most of them are not meant to deal direct damage to opponent. There is fewer amount of them, but the biggest difference has to be the fact that using prosthetic tools requires spirit emblems. I'm definitely not suggesting that runic attacks are a better system than Sekiro's prosthetic tools. For me, it's even stupid to compare them on that level, which is better and which is worse. I'm interested in describing how they differ and how those differences influence the game experience. The fact that prosthetic tools are using spirit emblems means that you cannot just stand and spam shuriken throws or endlessly spam this fire cannon arm thing. You have to plan your actions more carefully. In Sekiro, there are also multiple ways in which you can chain together prosthetic attacks with the regular katana attacks. You can perform a quick follow-up, you can hold button longer for more powerful prosthetic attack, you can perform them mid-air, which often gives you quite unique effects. There are a lot of possibilities. God of War is all about the spectacle, about brutal and detailed finishers, about strength. Of course, there is some level of planning when it comes to enemy encounters, but it is much more forgiving than Sekiro, especially when it comes to the special attacks. Runic attacks may not be as complex as prosthetic tools. They may not have as many combos, follow-ups as special attacks in Sekiro, but they are not about that. They serve a different purpose. They are meant to break up the monotony, to be a feast to the player's eyes. At the same time, using prosthetic tools in Sekiro forces the player to make constant decisions. Should I use my spirit emblems by using this tool? Should I spend the upgrade resources I've collected to upgrade this or that prosthesis? Sure, they are still really fun to use, but those, more or less, subtle differences make experiences of using prosthetic tools and runic attacks feel so different. I'm writing this outro when everything else is already done. Writing, getting the footage, editing. It's my first time doing it like that. Normally I would write the whole script, then record the audio and get the gameplay footage, and lastly, edit the whole thing. But I didn't know what to say in the outro, so I left it unfinished for a really long time. I didn't want to just repeat the things I've said throughout this video. If you don't agree with me, listing out the conclusions from previous chapters probably won't change your mind. So instead, I want to invite you to the comment section. I'd like to know your opinions on this subject. How small differences, adjustments, tweaks can drastically change the game feel. Maybe you know some cool examples from other games, or maybe you just wanna tell me how stupid this video is. Also, it's been a long time since I've made a video like that, so it also would be cool to get some feedback. Do you like it? How was the editing? The audio? Maybe you've watched some of my previous stuff. How this video compares to my icebergs? I crave for your feedback, so if you have a spare minute or two, I would be super thankful. And yeah, that's it. I think that's all I wanted to say, so thank you for watching my video and to the next time.